everyone. Welcome back to Practically Intelligent. Today we're interviewing Sanjay Kalra, one of the founders and the former CPO of Lacework, a cybersecurity unicorn in the cloud security space. Sanjay was a former founder who sold his company to Zscaler, a public cybersecurity company, and wrote a really interesting blog post on the risks with generative AI in security. And so today we're going to pick Sanjay's brain a little bit about some of the threat vectors that are obvious and not so obvious, and how he sees professionals and engineers needing to respond to the challenge. I think he does a really great job of sorting out different threat vectors into different buckets, and then also gives us clear examples that maybe your average machine learning engineer or data scientist hasn't thought of.
Yeah, and I think that the idea that a lot of people haven't really thought about a lot of the generative AI security risks and concerns is going to be a common theme in our conversation, right? A lot of people are using Gen AI. Not everybody is thinking about what the implications are. So, without further ado, let's jump right in, huh? Hey, Sanjay, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. Nice. Thanks for inviting me to the podcast.
Of course. So I want to start with the post that you wrote back in November of 2023. And it was a very enlightening post because some of the statistics in that post are kind of eye-opening. And of course, we're going to link to it in our show description, but just to call out one of the biggest ones that really kind of make me reread that paragraph over and over again. And so you ran a survey of, I believe it was 900 IT leaders across a bunch of markets. And in that survey, those IT leaders said that 95% of those organizations were already using generative AI tools in some way. And that's not the most interesting part. What was most interesting was the follow-up was that 89% of those people also admitted that generative AI is a potential security risk. So how do you reconcile a technology that everyone is so eager to adopt? However, they also admit it is a security risk.
Yeah, I think it's interesting actually. This story has been played before. Like when the cloud showed up, same thing happened actually. People were really scared of cloud because they were not sure what the security risk cloud will bring in. BYD happened, like bring your own device. Same thing happened actually. And I'll give you an example within Zscaler. We created a working group and we went to all functional areas within Zscaler, asking them, is there any application where they can use generative AI from HR, IT, finance, and marketing? And within a month, we had 86 different applications, ideas. And every CIO, CSO is going through that thing because every team comes up with different use cases actually, and they don't want to fall behind. And this is such a generational shift technology. These guys actually are being forced to jump in without understanding all the risks that come with actually moving to technology like this.
So I take your point that this has happened before, and that generational, this is more or less, in a lot of ways, one of the seminal technologies of this generation of leaders and companies and organizations. So to that end, and you don't talk about this too much in the post, but I know that you're really interested in thinking about these kinds of security risks from two main perspectives, meaning AI in security and the security of AI. So I want to start by kind of getting into some of those topics. I'm genuinely very curious to hear your thoughts on how generative AI in general, whether it's in the aspect of security itself or just being used as a technology, what are the potential vectors that people should be thinking about, right? Most people will think about things like, well, we need to think about bias that can leak out. We need to think about data that can leak. What are, in your opinion, what are the top considerations that people are probably not exactly thinking of day to day that they really should be thinking of when it comes to Gen AI?
Yeah, I think one of the things actually is that technology is really great, but it has been kind of built without thinking a lot about security in it. I'll give you a few examples actually. Like when you put data in a database, you can go and delete a table. In a Gen AI, once you put the data in a Gen AI, there is no delete button. There's no easy way to roll back data. It goes into this wild ocean and it's kind of there forever. You think about access control. There's no access control once you create an embedding. In a database, you have control over every table, every column. There is no access control. You look at in a traditional networking, we had always had a concept of a control plane and a data plane, where we always kept like what was management versus what the data is flowing in. In a Gen AI case, actually, there are three sets of data. There's the data actually which goes into the foundation model, the data which actually used for training, like fine tuning or RAG, and then there's a prompt. The Gen AI technologies, LLMs, don't distinguish between any of them. They treat the user information same as what that came from the foundation or the training. These things create a lot of challenges because now the technology is moving really fast, but they didn't really build a lot of these guardrails from the beginning. So the question is actually, what are the challenges? The first one, of course, is when you're using this technology, first is operational, because you have issues, things like data drift, hallucinations, because it's still evolving. There are a lot of issues, like you ask the same question, don't get the same answer next time. That works really well for unstructured. It doesn't work for structured data. Structured data, you have to be very exact. And a lot of the cases like finance or healthcare, you have to be more accurate every time. You can't give a different answer for the same question. The second problem actually is ethics. There's issues with bias. Like you want to be very careful when you're using it actually in your HR, like looking at the candidates for interviews or making vendor selection. How do you make sure it doesn't have the bias or toxicity that comes with it actually, because people can use it for any purpose. The third piece actually is around security. And when you think about security, you cannot actually, it's not a blanket thing, because people kind of start thinking, okay, I'm thinking about security of Gen AI. You need to also first think about how Gen AI is being used in your company. Because the first thing is maybe your employees actually are just using Gen AI chatbots. Second thing is maybe you bought enterprise owned AI applications like Writer or Grammarly or something like that. That's the second step. Third step might be that you are trying to build your own applications. Then your applications use foundation models without any changes, or you might do RAG or fine tuning, or you might end up building your own custom models. In all of these things, when you think about it, like there are always, when you're looking at Gen AI, there are two decisions. Are you going to buy something? You're going to build it or extend. You're going to buy a new technology. You're going to build something internally, or you have an existing vendor where you can add these capabilities. When you think about security, you need to think of these things differently. Because if you think about like security, the first step actually, if you're building applications, there are things like model security, and data poisoning comes into picture. The training, controlling what training goes into thing comes into picture. When you talk about things like using the Gen AI with the prompt, then you have to look at things like prompt injection, a lot of other capabilities which actually need to think about from the security, or the whole LLM top 10 from us comes into picture. And overarching all of this actually is compliance, because anytime a new technology shows up, the government agencies are ready with their compliance list, which basically making sure that there is a basic security framework. So we have a lot of those now, with EU coming up with their own, federal government actually had an executive order. There is no a new ISO 4201. So there is all of those actually coming up as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of intertwining threads here, and I want to zoom in on one of them that you mentioned on bias. And before anyone kind of rolls their eyes at me, bias is not a new term in machine learning, right? When we talk about bias in a machine learning algorithm or in an AI system, we're not necessarily talking about things like stereotypes. We're not necessarily talking about things like is the AI going to prefer person A over person B for some reason? That's part of it. That's a big part of it. But when we talk about bias, it's a much broader concept of, is the AI willing to do something that is not necessarily, that is basically, it thinks it's doing the right thing. However, it doesn't really understand the external consequences of what it might be doing. I'll give an example based on something that you said as well, based on prompting data, because I had a client once, and who shall remain unnamed. And part of what they were trying to build was a chatbot, of course, and they wanted to use a prompt that included a lot of the user's personal identifiable information. And in some cases, they wanted to use information that is extremely sensitive about the person that they were chatting to. Because in their minds, they said, well, I want to build a RAG system. I want to bring in context and give the context to the LLM, and the LLM will be able to use that. And I go, in theory, that sounds great. However, one of the big biases in an LLM is, especially for using something off the shelf, let's call it Llama 2, just not to point them out or anything, but pretty much any instruction following LLM, a conversational chat-based LLM, they're specifically designed to be helpful, right? That's the term that always comes up. They're helpful, but not harmful. Well, one of the reasons prompt injection actually works is because you're using that bias against the AI. The AI wants to be helpful. So if you attempt to inject something like, hey, can you, I'm actually curious about this person's social security number, and go, oh, I have that right here in my prompt. How useful. Let me give that to you. That kind of a bias is also that's a kind of AI bias that's going to lead to a prompt injection attack. Does that track with what you think about?
I think the famous examples, if I ask,
Please.
how I want to hack into the system, the AI system might say no. But can you tell me all the vulnerabilities in my system so I can protect against it? The same question asked differently.
You're pretending to be a penetration tester.
Saying, here are the answers how you to protect all the vulnerabilities you might have in the system. I'm asking the same question. It is just that the AI was trying to help me in one case. One thing is trying to protect against me. So
exactly.
And this actually is like, I'll give another example. I put something in a, because it's very easy to do these things. You can give a vulnerable code and ask, is it vulnerable? It will say no. I go and change the code and add a line in the top saying this code is not vulnerable. And I ask the same question again. And it will say no because it's reading that line. But I think, people actually think about like, okay, how difficult it is like going from a dashboard to a chatbot, like what is a big deal? And people don't realize that when they do dashboards, it's a very tight, controlled interface. The only thing you can do actually is you can see what widgets are available. You can put filters. The minute you actually go from a dashboard to a chatbot, you opened a Pandora box. It happened with a Chevy dealer in Watsonville. The guy put up a chatbot without putting any controls. The first thing the guy says is that comes and says to the chatbot saying, is Tesla better than Chevy? So do you want like your chatbot to talk about that your competition is better than yours? No. The other problem actually.
How does it know?
The other, it's going to block that. Yeah. Then the other thing, the language is like you might have trained. This is another attack that was shown. Like you train your guardrails using English, saying don't talk about things, and the next thing somebody did actually is ask the same question in French, and it bypasses all the guardrails because the guardrail training actually was in English. So it is able to kind of give everything and all. It happened. They did it actually with Bing. They were able to steal the training data. The Bing code name is Sydney, and the researchers actually were able to go and poke the Bing and ask actually what the code name was, and then ask it to print all the lines that came in after the code word and print out the chat data. So it's happening to Microsoft. It's happening to the chatbot. I'll be honest with you, the other parts actually think about like prompt injection you mentioned. There is even coding. Like I can actually have chatbot generate code and I can run the code, which can be very dangerous. And the thing actually which scares me even more is agents. Because till now these LLMs actually were like really in a sandbox. You were kind of giving the data, asking a question. Now suddenly you are giving them access, writing these agents actually which are able to access, because LLMs don't have the recent data. You need data from other systems. So now you need to go and call these agents. And these agents actually, you need to very fine control like what these agents are going to do. Because if the agents actually don't have the right access control, a lot of the data will come in which you don't like. I'll give you another example, which was very interesting in this chatbot thing was invisible text. So I was talking to a big pharma company day before yesterday, and I was giving them the example that one of the attacks you can do is that when I use AI to look at resumes, I can create a resume, you can create a resume. We put black font for everything. But what I do in my resume actually is I actually take the job description, create all kind of stuff around the job description and put on a white font and submit this resume. Now your resume and my resume on the paper are the same, but when AI reads it, I have lot more capabilities than you have. So I was mentioning that to them and they were like, this is happening to us. We actually had our suppliers submitting RFP responses with white on white actually, because they were expecting to get selected from the vendor selection process. So
And, and,
what's
and
go ahead, sorry.
yeah, I mean, there's so many examples. I think that's kind of the funny thing is there's so many examples, and I think a lot of it comes back to what you said earlier, which is to an LLM. For the most part, these data sources remain equal in its eyes, right? So when you said like Sydney, I believe that I assume that would be part of the foundational model pre-training, right? That was probably data that came in fairly early on that the model was able to just resurface, as opposed to putting something in a prompt like white on white text on a resume. Again, to the LLM, these things are roughly held equivalent. There is some research being done on the weight that they give on whether or not to surface information, but I think a lot of it comes down to the AIs are trying to help, and if you exploit that kind of internal sense of I'm trying to help this human who is talking to me, it's relatively easy to exploit something who is again just trying to help.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think the other part actually to remember is that like even though these training actually is happening for the foundation model, the other challenge actually in a lot of these foundation models actually is that the minute you do fine tuning, basically you're changing the weights, original weights with adding your own weights. It actually can break the alignment. So the best LLMs actually, once you add training, can like completely start talking about violence or be the do and anything mode because you lost alignment, and that actually is again a challenging part because now I can actually have and traditionally if you think about like the one of the challenge in the traditional security has been is that we all worked on data security, talk about PII data and things like that. But the problem is PII data actually typically you look at bag of words, you say this is a social security number, this is a credit card. But one of the advantages actually of the Gen AI is that it actually is able to understand the semantics of it. So when I say Chase Bank versus River Bank, it knows that one is a real bank versus one is not a bank, which is not possible. And same thing when I say I want to block violence, if I use the traditional data protection, it doesn't understand the violence is violence. But violence also means brutality and 500 other things. And that's only using an LLM you can understand. So you have to use this technology which is coming out to also to protect it against it actually.
We've talked a little bit, Sanjay, about the bias and the LM's bias to be helpful, about operational issues of they're non-deterministic in nature. On security, we've talked a little bit also about prompt injection as a kind of key attack vector. MITRE, which is a research organization, released its Atlas framework. It's like adversarial threat landscape against AI, and list a huge number of potential threat vectors, et cetera, that could emerge over the next 5 to 6 years. Rather than highlight the specific threat vectors, I'm curious what operationally is going to have to change the most in security teams in the next 2 to 3 years. There's obviously defending the prompt window, making sure our data is secure, but is there anything as a result of your time in this space and looking around the corner, how are security teams going to be run differently in 2 to 3 years? Which categories are going to change the most?
Yeah, I think my perspective is that we talked about like a lot about security of AI. So let's just topic to like AI in security. Like how can you
Yep.
use AI to build better security products? Because for me, it's like almost like security is a technology in service of business.
Yep.
Anytime technology changes or business changes, security has to change. And AI is both a technology and a business leap. So security has to change and evolve. And when cloud showed up again, there was issues with SaaS and all that stuff. But then companies like Zscaler were born because of cloud. So how do you use AI to build better security products? The first thing, actually, I'll be honest with you, like there has been a lot of things about co-pilots, but my perspective in all this stuff actually is that I think all this question and answer concept which we have right now, it's a transitionary thing. Because for me, I actually am looking forward to like more autopilots than co-pilots, because I want that co-pilot to transition where I actually want like this thing to do a task for me or not answer a question. Because for me, the biggest challenge today in security is twofold. One is there's a skill gap. They can't hire enough people. And the problem there also happened is that security guys actually have trouble hiring people for firewall and antivirus. them understanding firewall, antivirus, or EDR, and then understanding SaaS and Kubernetes and cloud and AI and Salesforce and build having expertise. They can't hire people to expertise in all these areas. So they need these AI systems to help them secure these systems. Second problem actually with the security guys actually is that they are their role is changing from a firefighter to a fire marshal. So in most of the time, they are accountable for things, but not responsible. They cannot fix anything because if Java vulnerability happened, they have to go to developers. If S3 open DevOps, if there is an issue with SaaS, they have to go to SaaS Ops. Everything they have to. So first thing is how do you kind of automate a lot of the tasks? I think where GenAI is going to be really, really helpful is automating the security operations, workflows, follow-ups, all of that I think can be done within security. The second piece actually, of course, is around, I kind of feel like the data protection, because right now there's a lot of false positives. So being able to create semantic aware data protection, so I can understand like when a credit card shows up, it is really a credit card and why it is there, instead of just saying it's a credit card. Maybe I'm buying something, it's okay. So being able to understand that, and then multimodal, being able to understand, look at somebody sending out like the blueprints out or sending a Zoom call. Can I look inside videos and images? I can't do that today with my current technology. Gen AI, I can do that. Training is a big deal because for me, like one of the biggest advantages of Gen AI is that I build a product, one product, but I don't have one customer. It's not I want to get to a market of one, because for me, like for my product, actually, I have a CIO, SSO, a network guy. I have a guy who speaks English, a guy who speaks French, a guy who likes video, a guy who likes text or white paper, and somebody wants to be in LinkedIn, somebody wants to be in Instagram. So when I think about that, like if I want to reach the same customer, I have like not one customer, but I have hundreds of customers for the same thing with different. And till now, it was not possible for me to create content for all of them. Same thing with security training. Based on what the user is doing, I can actually on the fly create training material for every persona and everything, but based on what, because humans actually are the weakest thing. So I think security training is going to get really, really disruptive. Vulnerability is like a massive thing, because right now when you're checking in the code, being able to see if it's vulnerable in the when you're doing the CI/CD pipelines. The second thing is these vulnerabilities show up, goes to the security has no clue what that vulnerability means. They don't understand Java code. Now I can explain in English language with Gen AI what it is. I can give the fix. They can go to the engineer saying how to fix it. That is, I think, the whole vulnerability management, app security is completely ripe for disruption. Synthetic data, like anytime I want to do any testing, building thing, it's impossible to do testing because I need to regenerate. So with security, I can actually, with Gen AI, I can create my test beds. I can, using Gen AI, I can actually set up my test setup. I can create synthetic data. I can test my products against all kind of attacks, everything possible, which was not possible. Deception, big opportunity, because till now being able to replicate every application, every customer, every user, everything, it was very difficult. With Gen AI, I can make digital twins of almost anything actually, and I can create like a test it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many examples here of synthetic data. We're talking about so many different vectors here. I guess is one of the answers to this question of, I want less copilot, I want more autonomy, but at the same time, agents are dangerous because they have access to your operating system, they have access to your files. How should compliance and kind of regulatory infrastructure, and how should they play with kind of technological innovators here? Like, what's the answer? I guess, like, is there a way that we should be thinking about how to move forward with all of these potential issues? Is it more coming from internal IT leaders, or should it be coming more externally, in your opinion?
I think we need both. I'll be honest with you. Like the reason people do things is for making money and saving money, and security actually doesn't make money or save money. It's an insurance policy. The only exception is compliance, because you do it because you don't want to go to jail. Or the other reason actually is compliance actually is a money maker, believe it or not, because compliance requirements comes from sales. Because I can't sell to Europe if I don't follow the Europe Act, or I can't do business in without PCI in the fintech. So having that regulatory thing actually helps, because getting at least everybody having a basic thing. But having said that, the basic hygiene, making sure it's not black and white. You can allow everything in AI to be used. You have to make sure you have visibility on what is being used. You're logging everything. You're basically making sure you're doing risk scoring of all AI apps, which you're going to do. You have data leakage preventions kind of a thing. So there are a lot of basic hygienes, doing more supply chain security. So a lot of the basics we had before need to apply, and there are some additional ones we need to do. But I think the key part is that, bottom line is, if you're not using the technology, hackers are using it. Because right now you have a fraud GPT, there's a warm GPT. I can actually go in and ask a fraud GPT to build phishing emails, would look at vulnerabilities. You had this thing happen in Hong Kong, $25 million lost because the guys did the fake Zoom call, and there's a fake CFO, fake guys, and they tell the guy to wire $25 million and 25 million is gone. So my perspective is that these hackers actually they don't have any controls. They move faster. So unless until the security industry actually and the security guys actually are ready to move at the same speed, and you kind of get tied, okay, it is dangerous, but at the same time, if you use it rightly, you can actually be ahead instead of falling behind.
That's super interesting. One other area that we've talked about, Sanjay, is, I mean, a lot of existing cloud security and principles is best off of access control and escalating levels of privilege. And you already
Mhm.
touched on it just to start, is that a lot of these foundation models and new LLMs fundamentally break our conception of access control. So I'd love to understand, how is role-based access control for developers and building applications going to need to change? I think right now, at least what I see is I see a lot of basic approaches to doing this that aren't reflecting the how embeddings and underlying datas and models actually work. So I'd love for you to share how RBAC and access control and identity might change in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I think that's a fundamental thing we need to solve before we can start using Gen AI. Because if you think about it, actually, the when you put a date, like, people talk about security, they talk about like network security or endpoint security, but in the end, it's all a proxy to protect the data. And any enterprise which actually you go in, the data access actually is different for every persona. Like, and you have data access for your customer data, your employees actually have access to some sales data, not sales data, or some projects, not projects. And intellectual property of the company is actually one of the most important aspects in any company. Customer data is really important. So if you're going to use these new generative AI, access control is really, really critical. And one of the challenges actually has been, is, as I said, because these embeddings don't have any concept of who owns the data. There's no tags right now in these embeddings. There is no, so a lot of the infrastructure around this access control actually have to be built. So the whole problem actually has to be rethought on how we make sure when the data goes in for training purposes or when it's coming out, we're able to apply the right access policies on this data. Because if you don't do that, nobody will deploy. I'll give you an example. Like, I don't know to name the company, but we tried internally to deploy a federated search company. We bought a license, and it took us a year and a half before we could deploy it. And the reason was not that the technology didn't work, because access control. Because a lot of the systems, like, because we can't just open up Gen AI and just say, go and ask a question, because if our system didn't really have the right access control, you will end up leaking a lot of data. So first we had to go and fix a lot of the access control issues before we could deploy anything actually.
And as a machine learning engineer, what are the bells going off in my head right now isn't this kind of what feature stores were for? Like, when these kinds of technologies of model stores, feature stores, access controls on data, they're not necessarily new topics of conversation, in my opinion. I've written about things like this before. What feels new to me, and Sanjay, I'm curious if you agree with this. What's new to me is that because the access to AI has gotten so much more, is so much smoother. It's so much easier to get access to these kinds of technologies through, the assistants for OpenAI. Now we have Claude 3. Because access to the AI is so much easier, you have all of these folk who are not necessarily thinking about, well, do we have a feature store? Do we actually? Because some companies actually do have access controls on data because they've been working in AI for so long. So is that fair in your opinion? Is the
Actually,
problem?
there's some truth to it. I'll just say there are two parts of it. I'll give you example. Like I was talking to one of the big semiconductor companies, and they were interested in building, adding all the processes they do and everything, all which is the key IP into the LLM. But the thing they worried about actually was that the minute they put it in, they're making it easy for people to see it, but they're also making it easy for people who are not supposed to see it, and easily see it actually. So that is a challenging part because, this is the thing I'll tell you, even for hackers, like if I hack your system now, I do a ransomware. Right now, I just make money by stealing or exposing your data. Next time, I'll put it in an LLM and ask the LLM how much money I can ask you based on your cyber insurance, how many files or records you have, how many credit cards you have. And within 5 minutes, I'll take this 400 gig of your traffic and I'll ask all the questions on how to make money out of your data. So that's one piece, of course, which is that it is democratizing it, making it easy. But there is a fundamental problem with the technology itself, because in traditional AI, you still work with traditional databases when you access the data. And the databases were built with, like over the years, have been built with amazing ability to do RBAC. You can go down to every column, every row, everything to say this column, this row, this field only can be accessed by this user or this role.
Mhm.
The problem actually is that in a Gen AI, the minute you convert a document or image or anything to an embeddings actually in a vector space actually have no concept of ownership. The embeddings actually are completely like kind of like, oh, like you have access to anything or everything kind of thing. That's why people have been using RAG and other capabilities, because without RAG you have zero access control almost kind of a thing. Because that's what been kind of using as to one of the reasons people use RAG is, of course, for the cost reasons, for access control and hallucination. But the traditional LLMs were never thought of like as being built with access control.
And back to your original point, if you're fine tuning or even pre-training an LLM with this data, if you don't catch it before it enters your corpus, your prompt response pairs, it's there. It's been embedded into the parameters to some extent, obviously, but if you're not catching it before it hits training, you're just out of luck. It's in the model somewhere.
Yes.
It is theoretically possible to resurface it in some way. So, okay, let's kind of zoom out, because I really want to hear some of your predictions over the next couple of years. Because to your point, right now, a lot of people are really focused on where it's hurting them today, which is things like prompt injection, data loss, privacy, security. Is this still going to be an issue in 2025 and 2026, or are we on the way to fixing it? And if so, what are we going to be talking about in terms of AI security in the next few years?
Actually, I did one of the things I did was this is a long time back. I went to the SANS list in 2000 and looked at the top 10 issues, and then I looked 15 years later and looked at the list again to see how many things actually were like same or different.
It was totally
Believe it or
different, I
not,
assume.
actually 80% of the, except there were new things like maybe added like for cloud security or some other one or two things, 80% stuff actually is like basic hygiene, like either using like stronger MFA, are you doing this like a vulnerability testing or like supply chain security, and like a lot of the basic stuff like how you have data protection, all that stuff. And the new threats being added, as I said, like it's more different. But my perspective actually is that still in all of these things, like a lot of the human is the weakest link in a lot of these cases. So a lot of the and the code which you're generating, the thing which worries me is that like let me ask you, like what if I went and kind of now hacked GitHub Copilot, and the next time you ask GitHub Copilot to generate code, it actually adds my vulnerability in every code it generates. What happens then?
I would say bad. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, but I'm just giving you an example. Like the
Yeah, I
thing
know.
which worries me is like those are the kind of things worry me. And then also these, as you said, we start getting more workflows. Right now, even though I'm calling for an autopilot, I still want human in the loop kind of a thing. But some of the basic problems will remain. But I think you will move beyond like some of the basics to more like how do you control these things. You look at what happened with Claude right now. I don't know if you saw a few examples with Claude in
Yeah.
the last 1 week. There are crazy examples, like the way it is going towards AGI. It's like it has its own personalities thinking about it, kind of a thing. And how do you keep and I'll be honest with you, like I'm not an expert, but a lot of it actually still looks like to me a black magic. Even the people who are building it don't understand what it does in some cases, and it's getting more and more to that level where it'll be very explainability is still a problem, and it's going to become an even bigger problem actually, especially when you use AI to make decisions, and that will be also a security problem actually as well.
So, we're talking about access and talking about hygiene, basic hygiene when it comes to AI, and probably having to define what even is basic AI hygiene going forward. A lot to think about. Sanjay, thank you so much for being on the show. You've truly given our audience, I hope, and I'm looking at you, audience. You've given us a lot to think about. There's a lot of vectors to consider, and if you are someone out there who is just planning to slap on some AI and some vector database, remember to think twice and hopefully a third time about what data you're putting into it and how you are controlling how that data flows in and out of that AI system. Sanjay, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Akshay.